Hi everyone, Mr. Davis here. I've been made aware that the previous version of this didn't record the sound, so I'm just going to run through it again quickly now. So as usual, we'll start off with some knowledge recall questions relating to definitions of key terms, this time focusing on fitness components and fitness components that are linked into the training methods that we will be looking at shortly. So pause the video here, just make sure you've got an answer down for each of these 5 questions. Try and do it without looking back at any previous notes. And then we'll pick it up again in a minute. Okay, so let's just tackle these one at a time. Hopefully you have these more or less word perfect. If it's significantly off, please make sure that it's purple penned so you have the correct version written down and you go over it a few times to make sure that you can remember it. So cardiovascular endurance is the ability of the heart and lungs to supply oxygen to the working muscles. Speed, the maximum rate at which you can perform a movement or cover a distance. Muscular endurance, the ability of muscles or a muscle to repeat contractions without fatigue. Flexibility, the range of movement, or you could have the range of motion possible at a joint. And maximal strength is the largest force possible in a single contraction. If you found that tricky, can you please make sure that you go over your class notes from when we looked at fitness components? And it's so important that you learn these. It's not just going to cost you 1 or 2 marks, it's going to cost you, upwards of 10, 15 marks in the exam if you don't know these definitions, because they offer you the introduction to your level mark questions and questions which require a definition at the start of them. So word of warning, please make sure that you're very much on top of the definitions. Okay, training methods. So we've looked at a couple in our practical lessons. We looked at circuit training and we did some plyometric training last week. This one is just a theory session where we're just going to give an overview on how to evaluate the training method. So when you're evaluating it, you're essentially looking at the positives and the negatives. You're weighing up the pros and cons and thinking about how suitable each training method is for a particular performer. So if we have the title training methods underlined at the top of the page, and then our learning objective, which you need to note down, I will learn to evaluate suitability or appropriateness, same sort of thing, of different training methods. Just make sure you've got that down before we move on. And then in terms of the main task, let me just give you an overview of what I'm hoping you can get done today. And then I'll go through each training method in a little bit more detail. So the overall task for you, 4 paragraphs summary detailing the suitability of each training method for a games player of your choice. Now, I don't mind if you want to stick to the same games player, so for instance, a footballer all the way through, or periodically you can change the games player, so you could focus on a rugby player, a netball player, a basketball player, a football player, a tennis player, and a cricket player, and you could focus on that. It's the actual exam technique, if you like, that we're looking at here in terms of the evaluation. Some of the comments that you can make are kind of generic across lots of different games players, but if we focus on the idea of a games player rather than, for instance, an athlete like a 100 meters sprinter or a high jumper, for the purpose of this, let's focus on some form of games player. So it's usually team sports or potentially racket sports you could use. And then for each one, just so you're clear on each of the 4 paragraphs, don't feel too daunted because it's hopefully not quite as demanding as it might first appear. The first paragraph, you simply need to give a definition or a very brief description of the training method. So the definition should comprise of 2 key parts. You essentially say what it involves. So circuit training involves, and then you go on to say what it is, just in 1 or 2 statements, and then what fitness component it's targeted. So circuit training would be the arrangement of a series of exercises in stations to improve muscular endurance. So it's got 2 parts, and that's all that you need to do for essentially the first paragraph. And then in a new paragraph, you identify the positive links between the training method and the chosen sports performer. Now, when you're linking the training method to the sports performer, what you're essentially doing is saying how the fitness component that's being targeted in the training method can be used by that performer. So if we were looking at circuit training, it's muscular endurance. So you give a couple of examples of how that sports performer, for example, a footballer, would benefit from increased levels of muscular endurance. So a footballer would benefit from muscular endurance because, and then you give a couple of key examples where you feel that muscular endurance would be an important fitness component when the performer is performing some sort of technique or movement or skill in the game. Ideally, a couple of examples there. Then the third paragraph, you're detailing the advantages, and try and do this in full sentences in a proper structured paragraph rather than just brief bullet pointed notes. Do it as if this is a level marks question. So the third paragraph, advantages, for instance, positive statements about the suitability of the training method for that sports performer. And I'm going to detail some of the key things which you can comment on there. And then finally, fourth paragraph, disadvantages for each one. So the negative statements, potentially why that training method may not be entirely suitable. It's possible that you could comment on the same sort of thing in paragraph 3 and 4, depending on, for instance, the age or the ability of the performer. But we'll get into that in a minute. So just to be clear, definition or basic description, positive links between the training method and the sports performer, then advantages and disadvantages. So here we go. I'm going to go through one or two of them, and then I'm going to just let you get on with it for the rest of them, because it's the same sort of things that you're going to be reflecting on and making a judgment on. So as I say, if we were looking at circuit training, now this is one that we did as a practical activity. So the primary fitness component, I'm just going to do this in note form because it's difficult writing on here, but is muscular endurance. That's the main fitness component. Now with circuit training, along with lots of other training methods, there may be secondary benefits to other fitness components as well. The most obvious one being cardiovascular endurance, possibly some agility, possibly some strength, possibly one or two other things as well. But the main benefit of circuit training is that it improves muscular endurance. It's that repeated contractions to try and work against the fatigue that builds up when you're doing your press ups and you're doing your sit ups and you're doing your shuttle runs and your squats and your lunges. You're repeating the contraction over and over and over. That's what you're developing here. Now, in the most part, you're going to focus on circuit training as an anaerobic training method. So you're working in the absence of oxygen. Now, because there are rest periods built into the circuit training, there's an element of aerobic work in there as well, because there's some recovery time and it allows you to take on board that oxygen as well. But for the most part, particularly if it's done at a high intensity, you're going to be working it in an anaerobic way. Now, in terms of the sports, one of the benefits of circuit training is that it's suitable to a wide range of sports. It's not that circuit training wouldn't be suitable for many sports. I'm struggling to think of any that you couldn't do circuit training for, because muscular endurance is such a generically important fitness component. So regardless of what sports performer you've chosen to focus on, whether it's footballer, basketball player, hockey player, you give the examples from that sport where you think repeated contractions, so running being the obvious one, running, jumping, sprinting, that sort of thing, but also any particular skills which are repeated in the sport, most obvious ones being things like kicking the ball in football, or jumping up to head the ball if you have to do that regularly. Anything that you're repeating a contraction on, bouncing the ball in basketball, shooting and passing the ball in netball, those are examples where muscular endurance is required. So you can use that for the second part. And then the meaty part of the work, the bit which really focuses on the evaluation, advantages and disadvantages. Now, it doesn't matter which the order that you do these in, and it doesn't matter if you don't do them all, but you need to come up with a selection of statements focusing on at least 2 or 3 which you can go into in a little bit of detail, which outline why you think it's an advantage or a disadvantage for your sports performer. So let's just start from the easiest way to do this is kind of do it in alphabetical order. So we do the A's first and then we work our way along. So is it appropriate? So the primary thing that you're looking at whenever you're looking at any training method is the age and the ability. In general terms, the younger you are, the lower your ability is going to be. I know that's a bit of a kind of a generalization, but essentially when you're young, you're more likely to be a beginner. Is circuit training something that could be appropriate for a beginner to do? Think of the safety implications. Are they using any heavy equipment? Are the techniques particularly difficult? Or do you think that there are a series of exercises that you could do in a circuit which actually, whilst every technique that you do has some sort of focus on a correct way of doing it, but actually doing lunges and doing squats and doing press ups, that's not the most demanding exercise in the world. You're not likely to cause yourself a serious injury. So essentially what I'm saying is that it could be adapted to make it appropriate for all ranges of abilities. If anything, you have to adjust the type of exercise that you do to make it appropriate for higher level performers, because just doing a few lunges and a few press ups isn't actually going to benefit an elite performer. So that's the sort of thing that you've got to comment on there. It could be that you're making positive statements about how appropriate it is, but it could also be that you're holding back a few potential negatives. Now, you're not saying circuit training is a bad method of training. What you're saying is that for certain individuals, whether it be based on their age or their ability, adjustments would need to be made for the circuit training to be effective. Otherwise, it's not actually going to benefit the performer, so it's a bit of a waste of time. That's the point you're making. It could be that it is appropriate, but it could also be for certain performers maybe less appropriate because they're not going to benefit so much. Is it adaptable to this sport? So can you adjust it? Can you alter it in terms of how it's done to make it beneficial for your sports performer? And again, circuit training is very adaptable in terms of how you can adjust the exercises and the structure of the circuit. You can even build in skills into a circuit. So whilst you're focusing on the fitness element of the circuit training, you can also do a skills-based circuit, or at the very least incorporate skills into it. So for instance, instead of just shuttle runs, you can do shuttle runs whilst dribbling a basketball, or shuttle runs whilst kicking a football. So you can build in skills, so it can be made adaptable. On the flip side, you're not likely to be doing lunges and sit-ups and squats in the middle of the football pitch. So for that reason, you could argue that it's maybe not so sport specific, because the exercises that you do are not movements and techniques that are likely to be replicated in the game. So again, depending on which way you look at it, those are the sorts of comments that you could make. Right, the rest of them are fairly straightforward and you can just make a judgment call on it. Duration. How long does circuit training go on for? Well, obviously, that might depend on the particular performer being involved, but for the most part, you're likely to do it for 10, 15 minutes at least, possibly a lot longer, up to maybe an hour. But it could be done in a short period of time, in which case it is a suitable training method for performers in your sport. Having said that, if you're taking time to set things up and you're planning on doing it for a lot longer, then it takes a little bit longer to complete, and then maybe it's less appropriate. But in most cases, I think it's fair to say that you could do circuit training in a fairly short period of time, which makes it appropriate. It's also suitable for large numbers. You could do it on your own. You could do it for a couple of people, but you could also quite easily have it where 20 people are involved, like a whole football squad or a whole netball team. So the numbers, you're able to adjust the numbers to cater for large numbers of people. That makes it more appropriate. The difficulty is kind of linked into this one. So are there challenging techniques which performers would need to be aware of? Again, technique is always important to try and get it right, but it's not maybe the same as something like weight training, which, you know, requires very, very specific techniques to be used. Otherwise, you're likely to cause yourself an injury. Yeah, you shouldn't push your knee over your toe when you're doing lunges, and yeah, you're supposed to sit back down towards your hips on the squat, but it's not the end of the world if you're doing them ever so slightly wrong, because it's more about the effort that goes into circuit training. So depending on how you want to phrase that, you could say that there are techniques involved and that you need a coach or a trainer to show you how to do it. But equally, you could say that the exercises are not that demanding, and therefore circuit training is quite appropriate. Is it actually an interesting training method to do? Well, it offers variety. There's lots of different exercises you can do within it. You can change the structure of it. You can make it sport specific, so it's quite easy to justify it being one of the more interesting methods of training. I mean, ultimately, if you do anything over and over again, it might get a little bit tedious. But I would say that one is probably one where circuit training does offer that sort of variety that makes it a good method of training to do. Does it require lots of equipment? In the most part, no, it doesn't. You know, you don't see this girl here. No, 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 no equipment being used there. It's quite easy to do a circuit training session without equipment. Having said that, you could also make a comment in terms of its not being so appropriate, in that certain things may require some equipment, whether it's skipping ropes, battle ropes, little mini hurdles, boxes to jump on, weights, like light weights to do your lunges and things with. So you don't need to get into the details of it, but you can say that certain exercises may require specialist equipment. And in terms of facilities, it doesn't really require anywhere specific. You can do it on a field, you could do it on the basketball court, you could do it in the gym, you could almost do it in the classroom. So it doesn't matter where you do it. So that's a potential advantage. So from that, there are other things you could comment on, of course, but from that, there's a range of positives and a range of potential negatives that you can comment on there. And it's those things that you need to be making you make the judgment on it. You've got to put together, maybe make a little plan, and then you put the paragraphs together detailing those things. Okay, I'm going to go on now and talk about some of the other training methods, but that's the structure that you need to follow for each of them. So just to be clear, I'm just going to do a quick run through. I maybe won't spend quite as long as on this bit, but I just want people to be clear on these things. So fitness component for plyometric training, we're looking at the P for power, and essentially that's an anaerobic training method because it's an explosive, short, powerful movement. Again, in your links, anything to do with jumping or any sort of explosive movement, so that hopping, that skipping, that bounding, that accelerating, any examples from there. And then again, I'm not going to go through it all again because you've got to think about it for yourself, but is it an appropriate method of training for all these different ages and abilities? Can it be adapted? Does it need to go on for a long time? Is it suitable for large numbers? Are the techniques quite difficult? Is it interesting to be able to do over and over? Does it require certain equipment? Does it require certain facilities? You make the judgments and put your paragraphs together. Same thing for fartlek training. That fartlek training is often confused because the term itself is Swedish for speed play, and people think speed play, so the fitness component being improved must be speed. No, fitness component that you're working on is cardiovascular endurance. Okay, there may be a secondary benefit to speed if you're doing it, you know, over a long period of time, and during those periods where you're upping the intensity of the work, then potentially there's a little bit of faster running going on. But for the most part, it's cardiovascular endurance. So speed play is where you're just adjusting the speed and you're adjusting the intensity of the training that you're doing. Usually it's done through running, Usually it's done over like different terrain. So you might run up a hill, you might walk down the hill, you might run around the block, you might walk for a little bit. It's like interval training, but without the strictness of the timing. It's very kind of loose in terms of how it's set up. That's the whole idea. Speed play. You're playing around with the speed and the intensity of your work. So you're just going for a run, but you're changing the intensity throughout the run. Running, jogging, sprinting, walking, and mixing it all up. And it's actually a better method of training for improving cardiovascular endurance than something like continuous training, because the whole idea is it replicates the demands of the game better. So you don't run at the same pace for 90 minutes in a game of football. You start and stop and sprint and jog and walk and stop and sprint. And that's what you do in fartlek training. So it better replicates the demands of that game. It's essentially an aerobic method of training, because whenever you're working on cardiovascular endurance, it's always going to be aerobic, although there are elements of anaerobic work in there where you push the intensity up. And again, for sports, you're making those links of when you would need that cardiovascular endurance. So think of what period in the game or what specific instances in the game you'd need cardiovascular endurance, and then a selection of comments from these down here. Next one, weight training. So weight training, I think we all know what it is, but it's a case of using free weights, which are these ones where you can adjust the weight on the bars, or resistance machines to improve strength, power, or muscular endurance. So depending on how you structure your training, it could be that you're lifting heavier weights and less repetitions. So for instance, maybe 4 to 6 repetitions, that's going to target strength and power. Whereas if you're doing sort of upwards of 12 repetitions, obviously on a slightly lighter weight, you're lifting the weight more often, that's going to be muscular endurance. Weight training is predominantly anaerobic because you're working short explosive movements. In theory, if you're building in rest breaks, that rest break allows an element of aerobic work, but the primary method of work there is going to be anaerobic. And then any sports where you're using strength, any sporting examples where you're using power, so usually we're linking that to jumping, any explosive movement. And muscular endurance is just the repetitive contractions without fatigue. So anything that you're reproducing a movement or a skill or a technique, including the most obvious things like running and jumping, as well as more like specific techniques, that's when you're commenting on muscular endurance. And again, think about all of those different things. The obvious one, which potentially could link into this, is to do with safety. So is it a safe method of training? Well, it is safe, but it might depend on who's actually doing it. You know, for any of you guys, you're starting to maybe take an interest in it. I wouldn't want someone who's 6 years old to go into the weight training area and start trying to lift weights up. That's obviously not appropriate. That's something you've got to bear in mind. Continuous training, again, targeting cardiovascular endurance. This is just where you're maintaining steady pace, aerobic work for an extended period of time. So your heart rate is maintained all the way along. No rests, usually done for about 20 minutes, working somewhere between 60 and 80% of your maximum heart rate. So there's quite a lot that you can comment on in terms of your initial paragraph there for continuous training. And then sports, same again, any sport where you're using that. And then again, comments on this. So just running, go for a run for an hour at the same pace, same intensity. That's what continuous training is. Then there's lots of different comments that you can make here. Static stretching. So you might not associate this with a training method, but it's down as one of the training methods that you need to look at and potentially will get commented on. Static stretching, fitness component, flexibility, Essentially, it's aerobic. You're not working explosive movements. And sports, any sport examples where you're going to need flexibility, anything where you're stretching, reaching, kind of lunging out, trying to think of specific techniques where you might do that, either in your sport that you've focused on, or you could pick out another sport where you think it's more appropriate. Things like any sport where you have to catch, any sport where you have to stretch out and swing a racket. Those are good examples where you might need flexibility. And again, those are your comments. Interval training, so periods of work on rest to improve speed and power. Sometimes, or kind of closely linked to that, is high intensity interval training. In theory, you could have interval training that's not so highly intense, but for the most part, interval training is done through high intensity interval training. It's anaerobic, so you're working through periods of high intensity work when the absence of oxygen. Yeah, you have some rest periods, so you could say there's an element of aerobic in there, but for the most part, it's anaerobic. Sporting examples where you require those fitness components. When do you need speed? In what specific example might you need speed? When do you need power? What specific examples of your sport do you need power? So, and then you comment on those. So essentially, if you think of interval training, it can just be done through running. So you sprint for 10 seconds, then you walk back for the rest of the minute. Then you sprint for 10 seconds, and you walk back for the rest of the minute. And you do it again a number of times. That's interval training, high intensity interval training. But you can also do it in the structure of a circuit where you might do 45 seconds of press ups, then have a 15-second break, 45 seconds of high knees, then have a 15-second break, and you obviously work it through in a circuit. That's interval training. And then I think the final one is altitude training. Now we're going to look at this in a little bit more detail. I wanted to include it here just so we're clear that it is one of the training methods you need to look at. Again, cardiovascular endurance is the primary focus here. So altitude training is simply training at a high altitude to improve cardiovascular endurance. Now, high altitude, you could add in, is anywhere that's above 2,000 feet above sea level. I think I'm pretty sure it's either 2,000 or 2,500. You might want to double check that. But essentially, it's that high, you're in the mountains, you're working high up in the mountains, and we'll go into the details of it. It's aerobic because you're working cardiovascular endurance, and then your sports examples, wherever you need that. But just so you're able to make some sort of evaluation on it, just to give you a quick run through, these are some of the things that you might want to note down. So listen really carefully. Yep, it's above sea level. Now, at that sort of level above sea, you're often hearing the phrase that the air is thinner. It's thinner in terms of its oxygen content. There's less oxygen in the air that you're breathing in. Because there's less oxygen in the air, you find it difficult to breathe in, so you have to increase your rate and your depth of breathing. So even just walking high above sea level, you will find that you're breathing a lot quicker and a lot heavier, certain relative to what you would have done down at sea level. So just walking down the road at sea level, your heart rate maintains quite low. You're not having to breathe in very deeply. Doing exactly the same thing up at altitude, your heart is having to work much, much harder, and your breathing rate is increased significantly, both in terms of its rate and its depth, because it's harder to get the oxygen in to supply to the muscles. So as soon as you start working, it becomes really difficult, which is why it's, you'll often see when top footballers go to places like Mexico and Bolivia to play their games in the like South American championships, even the best players just find it impossible to work at anything like the normal level. You see, and it sounds a bit gross, but you see players being sick on the side of the pitch because they're not used to that level of intensity. They're incredibly fit, but they're just not used to it. So the benefit is that you improve your cardiovascular endurance because during this time of working, your body adapts, and your body adapts by producing more red blood cells. Red blood cells carry oxygen. So if you've got more red blood cells circulating in your body, you're able to carry a larger amount of oxygen to the working muscles. And that adaptation takes place whilst you're training, but it also lasts for a short period once you come back down the hill. So then once you get back down at normal sea level, you're essentially supercharged. You've got an increased level of red blood cells, which is able to carry that oxygen. But now you're down the hill, there's a much higher proportion of oxygen in the air. So you're getting loads and loads of oxygen, essentially meaning that you can work at a higher intensity for a longer period of time. Now it starts to wear off. It's not a long lasting effect, but for a short period, a week, maybe 10 days after finishing your training, you will feel the benefits of it. So the air is thinner, a lower content of oxygen. Your body adapts by producing more red blood cells. The red blood cells are able to carry more oxygen to the working muscles. So when you come down and start working at a normal sea level or normal level of altitude, you're supercharged, and it essentially means that you will maintain a higher level of performance, higher intensity of performance for longer than you would have normally done. There's lots of downsides, not least the fact that mountains aren't readily available. It takes a huge level of motivation. You have to work through altitude sickness, which is where you start to feel dizzy and sick being up the mountain, to the point where you might not be able to train. And if you can't train, it defeats the whole purpose of actually being up there in the first place, because you're potentially just kind of regressing in terms of the progress that you've made. We'll look at it in more detail, but that obviously has implications for how appropriate it is, particularly in terms of age and ability, the duration that it takes, the difficulty of it. When we're talking facilities, but we're also just talking about the environment that's required to do it. So it's not something that's readily available. Lots of things that you can comment on there, all the benefits, and the fact that it is extremely beneficial for, particularly obviously for elite performers, and it's a different type of training, which makes it quite interesting. In theory, you could do it with large numbers, doesn't really require any great equipment. So there's lots of positives, but offset against some quite significant kind of side effects and negatives. So try and produce a series of paragraphs for that. I think that's the last one. So for each one, the definition, the kind of the description of what it involves and what the training method is developing. Some positive links, so what fitness component, how the fitness component is going to benefit you in that training, and then the advantages and disadvantages, commenting on a range of these things from the bottom of the screen for each training method. Okay, quite a bit of work, but hopefully it's something that you'll find interesting and put you in a good position for the return to school. Okay, guys, take it easy. Thank you. Bye-bye.